The autumn light filtered through the circular attic window in thin golden streams, each mote of dust dancing like memories suspended in time. Sarah Clarke stood motionless at the top of the narrow wooden stairs, her hand frozen on the brass doorknob, listening to the familiar sound of her father's voice drifting up from below. Edward was humming again, the same melancholy tune he'd carried in his throat for as long as she could remember, a melody that seemed to hold more sorrow than any song should bear. At 31, Sarah had learned to read the subtle signs of her father's moods, like changes in weather. The humming meant he was thinking of her again, the woman whose name was never spoken, but whose presence filled every corner of their small cottage like invisible smoke. Sarah had grown up surrounded by this ghost, this phantom love that shaped her father's every gesture, every glance toward the harbor, every evening spent in his chair by the fireplace with a book he never quite finished reading. The leathered journal in her hands felt heavier than its size should allow. She had discovered it 15 minutes earlier, tucked behind her mother's trunk with the deliberate care of someone who meant for it to be found, but only by the right person at the right time. The initials M.W. were pressed into the cover in fading gold letters, and beside it had lain a silver locket, identical to the one her father carried in his vest pocket, the same locket he turned over and over in his palm during quiet moments, believing no one noticed. But Sarah had always noticed. Just as she had noticed the way strangers sometimes stared at her with recognition before quickly looking away, as if she reminded them of someone they weren't supposed to remember. Just as she had noticed how her birth certificate listed Boston as her birthplace, though her parents claimed she'd been born in Millhaven. Just as she had noticed that her earliest memories began when she was 4 years old, with nothing before that but strange dreams of a woman with dark hair who sang lullabies in a voice that sounded like coming home. The humming stopped abruptly, replaced by the creak of floorboards as Edward moved from the kitchen to his favorite chair. She knew he would be settling in for another evening of staring into flames that seemed to hold conversations he'd never been allowed to have. This ritual had intensified since her mother, Helen's death 2 years earlier, as if grief had finally given him permission to mourn not just the wife he'd lost, but the love he'd never been able to claim. Sarah pressed her ear to the attic floor and heard the familiar soft scraping sound of metal against fabric, her father reaching into his vest pocket for the silver locket, beginning his nightly communion with whatever secrets it contained. She had seen him perform this ritual thousands of times, but tonight, with the journal in her hands and its twin locket in her pocket, she finally understood what she was witnessing. The journal felt warm against her palms, as if it had been waiting decades for her touch. She could open it now, could finally learn the truth about the woman who had shaped her father's life more completely than any presence ever could. But something made her hesitate. a sudden understanding that once she read the words inside, everything would change. Not just her understanding of her father's past, but her understanding of herself, of who she was and why she had always felt like she was waiting for something she couldn't name. Below, Edward's humming resumed, the same haunting melody that had been the soundtrack to Sarah's childhood. But now she recognized it for what it truly was, not just a song, but a prayer. A decades-long conversation with someone who had vanished without explanation, leaving behind only questions that grew heavier with each passing year. Sarah opened the journal to the first page and found an inscription, written in handwriting that seemed familiar despite being completely unknown. For my daughter Sarah, should she ever need to understand why some choices are made in darkness, and why love sometimes requires the cruelest kind of sacrifice. The world seemed to tilt slightly on its axis. Sarah gripped the journal tighter and settled onto the dusty attic floor, preparing to learn the truth about a love story that had been unfolding around her entire life, hidden in plain sight. The autumn of 1916 had been unusually warm in Mill Haven, Massachusetts, stretching summer's golden embrace well into October. The harbor market bustled with the energy of fishermen returning from the morning catch, their voices carrying across the salt-tinged air as they hawked the day's prizes. Silver mackerel still gleaming with seawater, cod heavy and white-fleshed, lobsters that clicked their claws in wooden traps like castanets, marking time. Edward Clarke had been 26 that fall, his hands already bearing the calluses and scars that marked him as a man who earned his living from the sea. But unlike the other fishermen who spent their shore time in taverns or gaming houses, Edward could be found most afternoons at the edge of the market, where a small cluster of vendors sold items that had nothing to do with the ocean's bounty: books, writing paper, and the kind of small luxuries that spoke to hungers the sea couldn't satisfy. It was there, on a Tuesday afternoon, when the light held that particular golden quality that only comes in autumn, that Margaret Whitfield first spoke to him. Edward had been examining a volume of Tennyson's poetry, running his work-roughened fingers along the leather binding with the reverence of a man who understood that books were miracles, thoughts and dreams preserved in ink and paper, waiting to be discovered by anyone brave enough to open them. "That's the Lady of Shalott," came a voice beside him, soft but clear as the church bell that marked the hours in Mill Haven's town square. "Do you know that poem?" Edward looked up to find himself face to face with the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. Not beautiful in the obvious way of the actresses whose photographs appeared in magazines, but beautiful in the way that morning light is beautiful when it first touches calm water, natural, essential, and somehow necessary for the proper functioning of the world. Margaret Whitfield was 23 that autumn, the eldest daughter of the family that owned Whitfield & Sons General Store, the establishment that served as the commercial heart of Mill Haven. She had grown up watching people come and go, observing their needs and desires from behind the counter where she helped her father manage the endless details of keeping a community supplied with everything from salt pork to Sunday ribbons. But Margaret had always felt like an observer rather than a participant in the life that swirled around her. She watched other people fall in love, marry, build families, pursued dreams that seemed as tangible as the goods on her father's shelves. Her own life felt suspended, as if she were waiting for someone to tell her that her real story could finally begin. "I've tried to read it," Edward replied honestly, closing the book but keeping one finger between the pages to mark his place. "But I confess some of his meanings escape me. Poetry seems to require a different kind of education than I've managed to acquire."
Margaret's response was a smile that seemed to illuminate something that had been waiting in darkness. "Perhaps it just requires the right conversation partner." The words hung between them for a moment that seemed to stretch beyond its natural boundaries. Edward felt something shift in his chest, like a compass needle finally finding true north after years of spinning aimlessly. Margaret felt her heart begin to beat with a rhythm she'd never experienced before. Not the quick flutter of nervousness, but the steady, strong pulse of recognition. "I'm Edward Clarke," he said, extending his hand with a formality that seemed both natural and somehow momentous. "Margaret Whitfield," she replied, and when their hands touched, both felt the small shock of connection that occurs when two people who have been unconsciously searching for each other finally meet. The embroidered promise. Their courtship began in the careful spaces between propriety and desire. Edward would find reasons to visit Whitfield and Sons when Margaret was working behind the counter, always purchasing something necessary: fishing line, candles, writing paper, but spending far longer than any transaction required discussing the books that Margaret kept on a small shelf behind the register. Margaret, for her part, began setting aside volumes she thought might interest him, collections of poetry, novels by authors who wrote about the sea, philosophical works that explored questions about the meaning of work, love, and the pursuit of happiness. She would slip small pieces of paper between the pages, notes about passages that had particularly moved her, questions about ideas that seemed worth exploring, observations about characters who reminded her of people they both knew in Millhaven. 3 weeks after their first meeting, Margaret presented Edward with a gift that would become the symbol of everything they meant to each other: a white cotton handkerchief embroidered with their initials intertwined in pale blue thread. The needlework was exquisite, each letter formed with the precise stitches that spoke of hours spent in careful, patient labor. "I made this for you," she said, her voice carrying a tremor that revealed how much the gesture meant to her. I thought you might carry it when you're out on the water, something to remind you that someone on shore is thinking of you." Edward accepted the handkerchief with hands that shook slightly. No one had ever made something specifically for him before, something that existed solely because she had imagined him needing it, wanting it, treasuring it. He pressed the soft cotton to his face and breathed in the scent of lavender soap and the indefinable fragrance that he was beginning to recognize as uniquely Margaret's.
"I'll carry it always," he promised, and meant it with every fiber of his being. The handkerchief became his talisman. He kept it in his shirt pocket while fishing, touching it whenever the work grew dangerous or the weather turned threatening. During their evening walks along the coastal path that led from town to the lighthouse, he would sometimes take it out to wipe salt spray from Margaret's face, both of them aware that the gesture was more intimate than anything propriety would normally allow between an unmarried couple. Whispers and warnings. By winter, their attachment had become the subject of considerable discussion in Millhaven. Edward Clarke was well regarded, hard-working, honest, with the kind of quiet intelligence that made people seek his opinion on matters ranging from weather patterns to local politics. But he was also a fisherman, A man who earned his living with his hands, who owned little beyond his boat and the cottage he'd inherited from his grandfather. Margaret Whitfield, on the other hand, was the daughter of one of Millhaven's most prominent merchants. The Whitfields had built their fortune on understanding exactly what everyone in town needed and ensuring they could provide it before anyone else thought to try. Margaret's marriage would be more than a personal decision. It would be a business alliance that could affect the economic landscape of the entire community. The whispers began in November and grew louder as winter deepened. Edward heard them in fragments, conversations that stopped abruptly when he approached, comments that seemed designed to reach his ears without being spoken directly to him. Different worlds, really. These romantic notions rarely survive reality. A fisherman's wife needs to understand what she's choosing. But more troubling than the whispers were the changes Edward began to notice in Margaret herself. She had developed a habit of glancing over her shoulder during their walks, as if concerned about being observed. She would sometimes fall silent mid-conversation, her hand moving unconsciously to touch the base of her throat, where she wore a silver locket that matched the one she'd given him for Christmas. One evening in February, as they sat on the bench at Lighthouse Point, watching ships navigate the harbour entrance, Edward decided he could no longer ignore what seemed to be growing between them like a shadow. "Margaret," he said gently, "you seem troubled by something, more than just the usual concerns about people talking."
Her hand went immediately to her locket, that gesture he'd learned to recognize as a sign that she was debating whether to reveal something she'd been keeping private. "Not troubled exactly," she replied, but her voice carried a note of uncertainty that contradicted her words. "Just aware that happiness like this feels too fragile to trust completely." Edward studied her profile in the fading light, noting the tension around her eyes, the way she held her shoulders as if bracing against some blow she could sense approaching but couldn't prevent. "Are you having second thoughts about us?" "Never," Margaret said immediately, turning to face him with such intensity that Edward felt his heart skip. "Edward, you must never think that. What I feel for you is the truest thing I've ever experienced. It's just that sometimes when something is perfect, you find yourself watching for whatever might destroy it." She leaned against his shoulder then, and Edward wrapped his arms around her, both of them aware that the gesture was more than romantic comfort. It was protection against whatever forces seemed to be gathering around them like storm clouds on a clear horizon. The proposal. Spring came early to Millhaven in 1917, as if the world itself was eager to move past the darkness of winter and into the promise of new beginning. The ice that had locked the harbor since January melted ahead of schedule, and by March, fishing boats were putting out to sea again, their crews eager to make up for the income they had lost during the frozen months. Edward had spent the winter months planning for a future he could barely allow himself to believe was possible. He'd saved every dollar he could spare, working extra hours repairing nets and maintaining equipment for other fishermen. He'd renovated the cottage he'd inherited from his grandfather, building bookshelves along one wall because he'd noticed how Margaret's face lit up whenever she talked about having space for all the volumes she hoped to collect. Most importantly, he'd spent hours crafting the words he wanted to say when he asked her to become his wife. Words that would capture not just his love for her, but his understanding of what marriage meant. A daily choice to notice and cherish another person, to build something together that would be stronger and more beautiful than either could create alone. The proposal came on an evening in late April, when the first real warmth of spring was rising from sun-heated earth, and the harbor was painted with the kind of light that made everything look possible. They had walked to their favorite spot at Lighthouse Point, where the bench they'd claimed as their own faced west towards sunsets that seemed to promise infinite tomorrows.
"Margaret," Edward said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to risk. "I know I can't offer you the kind of life that other men might provide. I can't promise you luxury or status or the kind of social position that your family might want for you." Margaret started to speak, but Edward held up his hand gently. He'd rehearsed these words for months, and he needed to say them while he still had the courage. "But I can promise you something that I think might matter more. I can promise you attention. The kind that notices when you're happy and when you're troubled and when something is weighing on your heart that you haven't told me yet. I'll remember every book you love and every idea that excites you and every dream you share with me, no matter how impossible it might seem." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small silver locket, identical to the one Margaret wore. Inside was a tiny photograph of himself, taken at last summer's church social, along with a pressed flower from the meadow where they'd had their first long conversation about poetry and dreams and the possibility of building a life together. "I want to marry you, Margaret Whitfield. I want to build something with you that will be worth all the years we'll spend creating it together. Will you have me?" Margaret's answer came in the form of tears that reflected the last light of sunset, followed by a kiss that tasted like salt air and promises and the kind of happiness that feels too perfect to survive contact with an imperfect world. "Yes, yes, Edward Clarke, I will marry you. And I want you to keep this," she pressed her own locket into his palm, "as a promise that whatever happens, you'll remember that I loved you completely." Edward accepted the locket without understanding why her words sounded more like farewell than beginning, why her joy seemed edged with something that looked disturbingly like grief. The engagement was announced in Millhaven's weekly newspaper on May 1st, 1917, with a wedding date set for the 15th of the same month. The brief notice mentioned that the ceremony would be held at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, followed by a small reception at the Whitfield family home. What the notice didn't mention was the tension that had settled over both families like fog rolling in from the ocean. Edward threw himself into wedding preparations with the methodical thoroughness that characterized everything he did. He ordered flowers from Boston, white roses that would remind Margaret of the wild roses that grew along the coastal path where they'd spent so many evenings. He purchased a suit that cost more than he typically spent on clothes in an entire year, justifying the expense because he wanted to look worthy of the woman who would be standing beside him at the altar. But even as Edward planned their future, he couldn't ignore the changes that seemed to be overtaking Margaret with each passing day. She had always been naturally alert, but now she seemed perpetually vigilant, as if watching for some threat that Edward couldn't identify. Twice, during their evening walks, she had pulled him into doorway shadows when strangers approached on the path. Men whose expensive clothes and confident manner marked them as visitors from Boston or perhaps New York. The most disturbing incident occurred 3 weeks before the wedding. Edward had arrived at Whitfield and Sons to walk Margaret home from work, only to find the store unusually quiet. Margaret was behind the counter, but her posture was rigid, and her face had drained of color. Standing near the door was a well-dressed man in his 40s, with the kind of predatory smile that made Edward's muscles tense instinctively. "Miss Whitfield," the stranger was saying, his voice carrying the cultured accent of Boston's financial district. "I trust you'll give my regards to your family. Please remind them that business arrangements in our circle require consistency." Margaret nodded without speaking, her knuckles white where she gripped the counter's edge. The man's gaze shifted to Edward with the dismissive assessment of someone accustomed to measuring other men's worth in dollar amounts. "And you must be the fisherman," making the occupation sound like something distasteful. "Harrison Blackwood. I'm a business associate of the Whitfield family."
Edward extended his hand, but Blackwood's handshake was perfunctory, designed to establish dominance rather than courtesy. "Edward Clarke. I don't believe I've heard Margaret mention you." "Oh, I'm sure Miss Whitfield has many things she hasn't mentioned," Blackwood replied, his smile widening in a way that made Edward want to step protectively in front of Margaret. "Family business can be so complicated." After Blackwood left, Margaret remained silent during their walk home. When Edward finally asked what business the man could have with her father, Margaret's response was barely audible. "Some connections can't be easily severed, no matter how much you might want them to disappear." The false clues. As the wedding date approached, Edward found himself collecting fragments of information that didn't quite form a complete picture. Margaret had become secretive about her correspondence, quickly tucking letters into her reticule when he approached. She had developed a habit of staring toward the harbor with an expression that looked more like someone watching for an approaching storm than a woman anticipating her wedding day. One evening, while waiting for Margaret to finish helping her father close the store, Edward overheard a conversation between two of Millhaven's more prominent matrons. "I heard she was seen talking to that Morrison woman again. You know, the doctor's sister-in-law who runs that establishment in Boston." "For unwed mothers, you mean?" "Surely not. The Whitfields wouldn't allow such scandal to touch their family. Unless," the first woman continued with the particular relish that some people reserve for other families' misfortunes, "the scandal has already touched them, and they're simply trying to manage the consequences." Edward felt something cold settle in his stomach. When Margaret emerged from the store, he studied her face for any sign that might confirm or dismiss what he'd overheard. But Margaret's expression revealed nothing beyond the careful composure she'd been maintaining for weeks. Another evening, while walking past the Morrison house, where Dr. Samuel Morrison maintained his practice and his sister-in-law Catherine ran what everyone politely called a boarding house for ladies in temporary difficulties, Edward noticed Margaret pause and stare at the building with an expression of such longing that it took his breath away.
"Have you ever wondered what it would be like to simply disappear?" she asked suddenly. To wake up one morning in a place where no one knew your name or your history, where you could become whoever you chose to be. Edward felt his heart skip with fear. "Margaret, what are you saying?" She turned to him with eyes that seemed to hold depths of sadness he'd never suspected. "Nothing, darling. Just sometimes I think too much about things that don't matter." But Edward could see that whatever she was thinking about mattered more than anything else in the world to her. The last gift. 2 days before the wedding, Margaret appeared at Edward's cottage carrying a small wrapped package. She was wearing a dress he'd never seen before, deep blue wool that brought out the green flecks in her eyes, and her hair was arranged in a style that made her look older, more sophisticated, almost like a woman preparing for a formal portrait. "I brought you something," she said, but her voice carried a tremor that suggested this was more than a simple pre-wedding gift. Inside the package was the embroidered handkerchief she had made for him months earlier, the one he carried with him every day, that bore the marks of salt spray and honest work and countless moments when he touched it and thought of her. But now it had been cleaned and pressed, the embroidered initials refreshed with new thread that seemed to glow against the white cotton. "I wanted to make sure it was perfect for your wedding day," Margaret explained, but there was something in her eyes that suggested she was really saying goodbye.
Edward accepted the handkerchief with growing unease. "Our wedding day?" he corrected gently. "Yes," Margaret replied, but the word sounded hollow, as if she was agreeing to something she no longer believed was possible. "Edward, I need you to promise me something. Anything. Promise me that no matter what happens, you'll remember that I loved you more than my own life. Promise me you'll remember that if I ever seemed to cause you pain, it wasn't because you weren't enough for me. You were everything. You were more than I ever dared to dream I could have." Edward felt panic rising in his chest. "Margaret, you're talking as if you're going away." "I'm not going anywhere," she replied, but her voice broke slightly on the words. Sometimes when you love someone as much as I love you, you need to say things out loud, just to make sure they've been said." That night, Edward lay awake, staring at the ceiling, Margaret's words echoing in his mind. Everything about her recent behavior suggested a woman preparing for departure rather than marriage. The careful way she'd been memorizing his face during their conversations, the questions about his childhood that seemed designed to collect details rather than simply satisfy curiosity, the presents that felt more like keepsakes than simple gifts. But when morning came, Edward convinced himself that his fears were just normal pre-wedding anxiety. Surely Margaret's strange mood would lift once they were actually married, once the pressure and uncertainty of engagement were behind them, and they could begin building the life they'd planned together. He had no way of knowing that while he lay awake worrying about wedding nerves, Margaret was sitting at her dressing table writing words that would explain everything and destroy everything 40 years later.
Morning preparations. May 15th, 1917 dawned with the kind of pristine beauty that seemed to promise perfect happiness. The sky was cloudless blue, the harbor was mirror calm, and the air carried the sweet scent of apple blossoms from the orchards that surrounded Millhaven. Edward woke before sunrise, as was his custom, but instead of heading to his boat, as he had every morning for the past decade, he spent the early hours walking the coastal path one last time as a bachelor. At Lighthouse Point, he sat on the bench where he'd proposed to Margaret and watched the sunrise over water that looked like molten gold. In his vest pocket, her locket pressed against his chest with each heartbeat, reminding him that in just a few hours he would no longer be alone in the world. He would be part of something larger than himself, connected to someone who had chosen to share her life with his, despite all the obstacles that seemed designed to keep them apart. The wedding suit felt strange against his skin, wool instead of the rough cotton he was accustomed to, a color that made him conscious of how he held his head, shoes that would never be comfortable on a boat deck but looked appropriate for walking down a church aisle beside the woman he loved more than his own life. At 9 o'clock, Edward presented himself at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, carrying the wildflowers he'd picked from the meadow where he and Margaret had first discussed poetry and possibility. The church had been decorated with white ribbons and more flowers, roses from Boston, as he'd planned, arranged by Margaret's mother with the careful attention to detail that marked all Whitfield family endeavors. The guests began arriving shortly after 9:30, fishermen and shopkeepers who comprised Edward's social circle, mixed with the merchants and professional men who represented Margaret's family connections. Edward noticed immediately that the two groups remained carefully segregated, as if an invisible line ran down the center of the church, separating those who worked with their hands from those who worked with money and influence. The waiting. By 10 o'clock, when the ceremony was scheduled to begin, Margaret had not arrived. Edward stood at the front of the church beside Reverend Morrison, his hands steady, but his heart beginning to beat with increasing irregularity. Margaret was never late. If anything, punctuality was one of her most reliable characteristics, a habit that Edward had always interpreted as evidence of how much she respected other people's time and commitments. Reverend Morrison leaned close and whispered, "I'm sure she'll be along shortly. Sometimes ladies need a few extra minutes to prepare for such an important day." But Edward could hear the uncertainty in the Reverend's voice, could see the way his eyes kept darting toward the church entrance, as if he too was beginning to understand that something was wrong.
By 10:15, the whispered conversations among guests had grown loud enough that Edward could no longer pretend not to hear them. He caught fragments that made his stomach clench with growing dread. "Always said this match was too ambitious. Different worlds, really. These romantic notions rarely survive reality." Mrs. Whitfield sat in the front pew, her face a careful mask of composure that couldn't quite hide the anxiety in her eyes. She kept glancing toward the church entrance, but her expression didn't look like a mother waiting for her daughter's arrival. It looked like someone dreading news they already knew was coming. At 10:30, Edward watched Mrs. Whitfield exchange a meaningful glance with her husband, then rise from the pew and approach him with measured steps. Her expression managed to convey both sympathy and something that looked disturbingly like relief. "Edward, dear," she said in a voice calculated to reach every person in the church,
I'm afraid Margaret has taken quite ill during the night. She sends her sincere apologies and asks that you postpone the ceremony until she's recovered." Edward looked into Mrs. Whitfield's eyes and saw something that made his blood turn cold. It wasn't maternal concern for a sick daughter. It wasn't embarrassment about a delayed ceremony. It was the expression of someone delivering a carefully rehearsed lie to an audience that included the person they were lying to. "Perhaps I could see her," Edward said quietly, still holding on to hope that this was a misunderstanding that could be resolved with the right words or gesture. "I'm afraid that won't be possible," Mrs. Whitfield replied with finality that left no room for negotiation. "She's quite indisposed." Edward turned to look at the older man, noting something in his expression that suggested he knew more about Margaret's absence than his words revealed. "Reverend, do you know where she is?" Morrison's hesitation lasted only a moment, but it was long enough for Edward to understand that Margaret's disappearance wasn't as mysterious to everyone as it was to him. "I'm sure the Whitfield family will explain everything when Margaret is feeling better." But Edward could see in the Reverend's eyes that Margaret wouldn't be feeling better, that there would be no explanations, and that whatever had taken her away from him was permanent in a way that sickness or simple delay could never be. He walked out of St. Matthew's Episcopal Church carrying the wild flowers that would never be part of a wedding bouquet, and into a life that would forever be divided into two distinct periods: the time when love had seemed possible and everything that came after. The empty house. Edward spent the rest of that day walking the familiar paths where he and Margaret had spent so many evenings. He went first to Lighthouse Point, where their bench sat empty under a sky that had remained mockingly beautiful throughout the day. He placed the wild flowers on the weathered wood and sat beside them, staring out at water that no longer looked like molten gold, but like an endless gray expanse that could swallow hope as completely as it swallowed ships. As evening approached, Edward walked past the Whitfield house, hoping to catch a glimpse of light in Margaret's window, some sign that she was really there and really sick rather than simply gone. But the house was dark, except for a single lamp in the front parlor, and when Edward knocked on the door, Mrs. Whitfield answered with an expression that made it clear he was not welcome. "She's resting," was all she would say, but her tone carried a finality that suggested Margaret would be resting for a very long time. For 3 days, Edward maintained hope that whatever had frightened Margaret could be resolved through patient conversation and gentle persistence. He returned to work because idle hands made it impossible to think about anything except her absence, but he found himself constantly scanning the harbor for signs of her presence, a figure in blue wool standing at the edge of the pier, or the flash of dark hair disappearing around a corner. On the 4th morning after the wedding that never happened, Edward's landlady knocked on his cottage door with news that confirmed his worst fears. "The Whitfields left town last night," she announced with the particular satisfaction that some people take in delivering dramatic information, packed everything they could carry, and departed on the late train to Boston. "Word is they've sold their business interests to someone who plans to manage the store from a distance."
Edward felt something fundamental break inside his chest. Not his heart exactly, but something deeper and more essential. His faith that love could survive the obstacles that seemed designed to destroy it, perhaps, or his belief that honesty and devotion would eventually triumph over whatever forces had torn Margaret away from him. Margaret Whitfield had vanished from his life as completely as if she'd been erased from existence, leaving behind only the silver locket in his vest pocket and questions that would torment him for the rest of his life. Learning to live with absence. Edward Clarke never married for love again. The loss of Margaret had carved something out of him that couldn't be replaced, leaving a space that shaped everything else in his life, like a wound that heals around a piece of shrapnel, forever marking the place where damage occurred. He continued fishing the waters off Millhaven, gradually earning a reputation as one of the most reliable men in the fleet. Other fishermen learned that Edward could be counted on during storms, that he would share his catch with families struggling through hard times, and that his quiet observations about weather patterns and fish behavior were worth heeding. But they also learned not to ask about his personal life, not to comment on the fact that he carried himself like a man who had loved deeply and lost completely. In 1923, 6 years after Margaret's disappearance, Edward married Helen Morrison, daughter of the same Reverend Morrison who had been scheduled to perform his wedding to Margaret. The arrangement was practical rather than passionate. Two people who had both been touched by tragedy, finding comfort in shared understanding of how love could be lost without warning or explanation. Helen was a good wife who never demanded what Edward couldn't give, and a devoted mother to the child they would adopt 2 years later. She was also perceptive enough to understand that she was sharing her husband with the ghost of a woman who had disappeared without goodbye, and wise enough not to resent an arrangement that provided her with genuine affection, even if it couldn't offer the consuming passion she might have found with someone else. Sarah arrived in their lives in 1925, a 3-year-old child with dark hair and eyes that held flecks of green like ocean waves just before they break. The adoption was arranged through connections Helen's family had in Boston, a private placement that required few questions and fewer answers. Edward accepted fatherhood with the same quiet dedication he brought to everything else, never asking about Sarah's background because he understood that some children come into families through paths that can't be easily explained. But from the moment Sarah entered his life, Edward felt something shift in the careful equilibrium he'd maintained since Margaret's disappearance. Looking at the child's face stirred memories he'd thought safely buried, awakened feelings he'd believed were permanently dormant. Sarah had a way of tilting her head when she was thinking that reminded him of someone he'd forced himself to stop remembering. She had a gesture of touching her throat when she was nervous that made Edward's heart skip with recognition he couldn't quite place.
The rituals of memory.
As Sarah grew, Edward developed habits that seemed designed to keep Margaret's memory alive without ever speaking her name. Every evening, he would sit in his chair by the fireplace with a book open on his lap. But neighbors who observed him closely noticed that his eyes rarely focused on the pages. Instead, he would stare into the flames as if they contained conversations he'd never been allowed to have, his right hand unconsciously turning something small over and over in his palm. Sarah learned early that her father carried secrets that were too heavy to be shared, but she also learned to read the subtle signs of his moods, like changes in weather. The humming meant he was thinking of Margaret, though Sarah wouldn't learn that name until decades later. The long silences during evening meals meant he was remembering conversations he'd never been able to finish. The way he would pause mid-sentence whenever someone mentioned Boston meant he was wondering if she might still be there, somewhere in that vast city, living a life that had nothing to do with the fisherman who had loved her completely. On Sarah's 10th birthday, Edward gave her a gift that seemed to hold more significance than a simple present: a small collection of books that included the volume of Tennyson poetry he'd been examining the day he first met Margaret. Inside the front cover, someone had written notes in pencil, observations about characters and themes that revealed a mind both educated and deeply thoughtful. These books belonged to someone special, Edward explained, his voice carrying a weight that suggested the someone was more than just a previous owner. She believed that poetry could help people understand their own hearts, even when their hearts were telling them things they weren't ready to hear. Sarah studied the handwritten notes with the intensity of someone who understood instinctively that she was being entrusted with something precious. The handwriting was feminine, but strong, with the kind of careful formation that suggested someone who had been educated to value clear communication above mere decoration. "What happened to her?" Sarah asked, but Edward's expression closed like shutters being drawn against a storm. "Sometimes people have to make choices that take them away from the things they love most, but that doesn't mean the love disappears. It just finds new ways to continue."
The questions that wouldn't rest. As Sarah entered adolescence, she began noticing details about her own history that didn't quite align with the story she'd been told. Her birth certificate listed Boston as her birthplace, though her parents claimed she'd been born in Millhaven. She had no clear memories of life before age 4, despite her parents' insistence that she'd been with them since infancy. Most puzzling of all, she sometimes encountered elderly residents of Millhaven who would stare at her face with expressions of recognition before quickly looking away, as if she reminded them of someone they weren't supposed to remember. One autumn afternoon, when Sarah was 15, she overheard a conversation between two of the town's older women while waiting for her father outside the post office. "That Clarke girl grows more like her every year," one whispered to the other. "Hush," came the sharp reply. "That's ancient history, and some things are better left buried." "But surely she has a right to know. She has a right to the life she's been given without being burdened by tragedies that occurred before she was old enough to understand them." When Sarah asked her parents about the conversation that evening, Helen's response was carefully neutral. People in small towns sometimes see resemblances that aren't really there. It's human nature to look for connections, even when none exist. But Edward's reaction was different. He looked at Sarah with an intensity she'd never seen before, studying her face as if cataloging features he'd somehow failed to notice during the previous 15 years. When he spoke, his voice carried a tremor that suggested he was seeing something that both thrilled and terrified him. "Sarah, do you ever have dreams about places you've never been, or people you don't remember meeting?" The question was so unexpected that Sarah felt her heart skip. "Sometimes," she admitted, "I dream about a woman with dark hair who sings lullabies in a voice that sounds like coming home. And sometimes I dream about standing at a train station, watching someone disappear into a crowd while I try to call out to them but can't make any sound." Edward's face went pale. "What else do you remember about the woman in your dreams?" "She wears a silver locket that catches the light when she moves, and she always seems to be saying goodbye, even when she's holding me close. Papa, why are you asking about this?" But Edward couldn't answer, because acknowledging what he was beginning to suspect would require him to accept that the past 40 years of his life had been built on a foundation of secrets that were finally demanding to be revealed.
The Year of Revelations. When Sarah turned 25, Helen Clarke was diagnosed with the lung condition that would eventually claim her life. During the months of her gradual decline, she began speaking about things she'd kept private for decades, as if approaching death had given her permission to share truths she'd previously felt obligated to protect. "Your father loved someone before me," Helen told Sarah one afternoon while they sat beside her sickbed. "Loved her with the kind of completeness that only happens once in a lifetime, if we're lucky." Sarah felt something shift in her chest. Not surprise exactly, but recognition of something she'd always suspected without being able to name it. What happened to her? "She disappeared," Helen replied, her voice growing weaker but more urgent, as if she needed to share this information while she still had strength. "Vanished the night before their wedding, without explanation or goodbye. Your father spent years believing she'd chosen to leave him, that their love hadn't been strong enough to overcome whatever obstacles stood in their way. But you don't think that's what happened?" Helen's eyes met Sarah's with an intensity that seemed to burn despite her failing health. "I think Margaret Whitfield loved your father more than her own life, and I think she made a choice that destroyed her own happiness to protect his. I think she's the reason you're here, Sarah, though I can't prove it, and your father has never allowed himself to believe it." Sarah felt the world tilt slightly on its axis. "Mama, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that sometimes children find their way to the people who need them most, even when the path that brings them together is too complicated to explain. I'm saying that your father has been grieving 2 losses for 40 years, the woman who disappeared and the child he never knew he'd fathered." Helen died 3 weeks later, taking with her the secrets she'd carried for decades, but leaving behind questions that would torment Sarah for the next several years. After the funeral, Edward retreated further into the ritual silence that had characterized his relationship with grief, spending longer hours in his chair by the fireplace, turning the silver locket over and over in his palm while staring into flames that seemed to hold all the conversations he'd never been allowed to have. It was during this period that Sarah began her own investigation into the mystery that had shaped her family's life. She visited Millhaven's small library, searching through old newspapers for any mention of the Whitfield family or the wedding that had never occurred. She spoke carefully with elderly residents who might remember Margaret, always approaching the subject indirectly to avoid arousing suspicions about why she was asking. What she discovered was a pattern of carefully guarded silence, as if the entire town had agreed never to speak Margaret Whitfield's name aloud. But she also found fragments, a brief engagement announcement in the Millhaven Weekly from April 1917, a mention of the Whitfield family's sudden departure in the social notes from May of the same year, and most intriguingly, a small item from June noting that several prominent families have made generous donations to support Mrs. Catherine Morrison's charitable work with women in temporary difficulties. The pieces began forming a picture that both answered Sarah's questions and raised new ones that cut deeper than anything she'd previously imagined.
On that October afternoon in 1956, when Sarah finally climbed the narrow stairs to her father's attic, she was looking for more than just forgotten possessions to organize. She was seeking evidence of connections that seemed impossible until viewed with eyes prepared to see truth. Answers to questions that had shaped her entire understanding of who she was and where she belonged in the world. The dust motes danced in pale afternoon light as Sarah moved among the trunks and boxes that contained the accumulated debris of decades. Behind her mother's winter coats, tucked between a hat box and a collection of preserving jars, she found what she had somehow known she would find: a leather journal with M.W. pressed into the cover in fading gold letters, and beside it a silver locket identical to the one her father carried. Sarah opened the locket with trembling fingers and found exactly what her heart had been expecting: a tiny photograph of Edward as a young man, along with a lock of hair that matched the color of her own. The inscription inside the locket was brief but devastating: "For my daughter Sarah, with all the love I could never show you." When she opened the journal to the first page, Sarah found words that confirmed every suspicion she had carried for 30 years. For my daughter Sarah, should she ever need to understand why some choices are made in darkness, and why love sometimes requires the cruelest kind of sacrifice, you were named for the biblical Sarah, who waited so long for the child she was promised. I pray that my waiting will end when you find your way back to the man who loved your mother more than his own life. Sarah sank onto the dusty attic floor and began to read, her hands shaking as each page revealed truths that were more devastating and more beautiful than anything she had imagined.
May 14th, 1917, the last night. Tomorrow, I was to become Mrs. Edward Clarke. And tonight, I sit in my room still wearing the dress I'll never walk down the aisle in, writing words that may be the only honest thing I can do for the man I love more than my own life. I cannot marry Edward tomorrow. Not because I don't love him. God knows I love him so completely that I would choose death before causing him pain. But because marrying him would destroy him in ways he can't imagine. I won't be the instrument of his destruction. 3 months ago, I discovered I was carrying a child. For one brief, shining week, I believed this baby was Edward's, conceived during that November storm when our careful restraint finally gave way to something neither of us could deny. I spent those days imagining how I would tell him, how his face would look when he realized we'd be a family sooner than planned. But then I began counting more carefully, and the timing was wrong. This child wasn't created in love during a November storm. This child was forced on me during a September evening when Harrison Blackwood cornered me in our pantry while the men discussed shipping contracts in the dining room. I fought him. I need Edward to know that, should these words ever reach him. I fought with everything I had, but Harrison is twice my size and had been drinking heavily. When it was over, he straightened his clothes and returned to the dining room as if nothing had happened, while I locked myself in my room and tried to scrub away the feeling of his hands on my body. Harrison made it clear that if I spoke of what happened, he would not only destroy Father's business, but would spread lies about my character that would make me unmarriageable to any decent man. But worse than that, much worse, he made it clear that Edward specifically would suffer if I tried to expose him. "That fisherman of yours thinks he's quite the literary gentleman," said Harrison when he found me alone again a week later. "It would be a shame if he had an accident at sea. Storms can be so unpredictable, and men who work alone on the water, well, sometimes they simply don't come back." I realized then that Harrison had been watching Edward and me for months, learning his habits, his routines, his vulnerabilities. He knew exactly how to hurt me through Edward, and exactly how to hurt Edward through me. I cannot ask Edward to spend his life looking over his shoulder, never knowing when Harrison might decide to eliminate the only witness to what he did. I cannot ask him to raise a child while wondering if every day might be the last day he sees the sunrise over water he's loved since childhood. So I've made arrangements that will spare Edward this burden and protect him from Harrison's revenge. Tomorrow morning, instead of walking down the aisle to marry the only man I'll ever love, I'll board the early train to Boston. Mrs. Catherine Morrison runs a private home for women in circumstances like mine, women who need to disappear until their children can be born safely. Catherine has promised that after the baby is born, she'll help me start a new life somewhere far from both Millhaven and Boston. She also promised something else, that if the child survives and grows healthy and strong, she'll find a way to ensure she comes home to Millhaven when she's old enough to understand the truth. I'm leaving Edward the silver locket I wore every day we were together, and I'm keeping this one with his photograph inside. If our daughter Sarah should ever find this journal, I want her to know that she was loved before she was born, that she was wanted despite the circumstances of her conception, and that her mother chose to suffer rather than allow her father to be destroyed by association with Harrison's violence. If my daughter, Sarah, should ever read these words, and yes, I'm naming her Sarah
because Sarah in the Bible waited so long for the child she was promised. Please understand that your mother wasn't brave enough to marry the man she loved, but was perhaps brave enough to save him from a life that would have destroyed them both. Tomorrow, I board a train to Boston, and Mrs. Margaret Whitfield will cease to exist. But the woman Edward Clarke loved will live on in our daughter, and perhaps that's the only way love this deep can survive in a world that doesn't always protect the innocent. Edward, if you're reading this, it means our daughter found her way home to you as Catherine promised. Look at her face. Look at her hands. Look at the way she handles books like they contain something precious. She is you, Edward. She is us. And she is the proof that love never really ends. It just finds new ways to continue. With all my love, until the end of time, Margaret.
Sarah closed the journal and sat in the gathering dusk of the attic, tears flowing freely down her cheeks as she processed 40 years of questions that had finally been answered. Below, she could hear her father moving from the kitchen to his chair by the fireplace, beginning his nightly ritual of communion with memories he'd never been allowed to claim. She climbed down from the attic, carrying the journal and Margaret's locket, and found Edward in his usual position, book open on his lap, eyes focused on flames that seemed to hold all the conversations he'd never been allowed to have, right hand unconsciously turning his silver locket over and over in his palm. "Papa," she said quietly, settling the journal on the table between them, "I think it's time we both learned the truth." Edward took the journal with hands that shook, whether from age or emotion or the magnitude of secrets finally being revealed, Sarah couldn't determine. He stared at the cover for a long moment, tracing the initials M.W. with one finger, and when he looked up at his daughter, she saw tears in his eyes that looked like they'd been gathering for 40 years. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Behind Mama's trunk, beside a locket that matches yours exactly." "Papa, I think I've been waiting my entire life to read what's written in there." Together they read Margaret's words, Edward's voice breaking as he spoke the truth aloud for the first time in 4 decades. When he reached the final page, he closed the journal and sat in silence for several minutes, tears flowing freely down his weathered cheeks. "She was protecting me," Edward said finally, his voice filled with wonder and devastation. "All these years I thought she'd left because I wasn't enough for her, because she was frightened of marrying beneath her station. But she was protecting me from a man who would have killed me to keep his secret." Sarah opened Margaret's locket and showed him the photograph inside, the same image that had been taken at a church social 40 years earlier, now faded but still recognizable. "Papa, she left you more than protection. She left you me." Edward looked at the photograph, then at Sarah's face, and suddenly understood that Margaret's final gift had been walking into his life every day for 31 years, caring for him without knowing she was caring for her mother's lost love. "She kept her promise," he whispered, reaching across to touch Sarah's face with fingers that trembled with recognition. "She said you would find your way home to me, and you did. You've been taking care of your father your entire life without knowing that's exactly what you were meant to do."
The Lighthouse at Dawn. Edward lived for 6 more years after the discovery of Margaret's journal, and they were the happiest years of his life since 1917. He and Sarah spent countless evenings talking about Margaret, about the sacrifice she had made, and about the miracle that had brought her daughter back to the man who had loved her mother more than life itself. On the morning of his death in 1962, Edward asked Sarah to help him walk one final time to Lighthouse Point. The autumn air was crisp with the promise of winter, and the harbor reflected sky so blue it looked like hope made visible. They sat on the bench where Edward had proposed to Margaret 45 years earlier, and where he had spent so many solitary evenings since then, waiting for someone who would never return. From his vest pocket, Edward withdrew the embroidered handkerchief that Margaret had given him the night before their wedding, the one she had cleaned and pressed and returned to him with initials that seemed to glow against the white cotton. Beside it, he placed both silver lockets, the one Margaret had given him and the one Sarah had found in the attic. "I want you to keep these," Edward said, his voice weak but clear, "not as reminders of sadness, but as proof that some kinds of love are stronger than the circumstances that try to destroy them." Sarah accepted the keepsakes with hands that shook like her father's had on the day she'd shown him the journal. "Papa, do you think she's still alive somewhere?" Edward looked out over water that had been the constant backdrop to his entire life, witness to his boyhood dreams, his adult labors, his decades of grief, and finally his understanding that loss and love were not opposites, but different faces of the same eternal truth. "I think Margaret Whitfield disappeared from this world the night she chose to protect me instead of marrying me. But I also think the woman who made that choice continues in you, Sarah, in your kindness, your strength, your willingness to care for someone without expecting anything in return. She lives in every book you've read, every thoughtful question you've asked, every moment you've chosen love over safety." Edward died that evening, peacefully in his sleep, with Margaret's locket in one hand and Sarah's fingers in the other. Sarah found him the next morning, still holding both, his face peaceful in a way it had never been during all the years she'd known him.
Sarah Clarke never married, choosing instead to remain in Millhaven, where she taught school and cared for the cottage that held so many memories of the love story that had shaped her existence. She kept her father's fishing boat moored at the harbor, not because she intended to use it, but because it seemed important to maintain the connection to the work that had defined his life before love redefined everything. Every evening, Sarah would walk to Lighthouse Point and sit on the bench where her parents had found each other and lost each other, and, through her existence, found each other again in ways that transcended the boundaries of time and circumstance. She would read from the books that Margaret had marked with careful annotations, feeling connected to the mother she had never known, but whose thoughts and dreams had somehow become part of her own intellectual landscape. On the 10th anniversary of Edward's death, Sarah made a decision that felt both spontaneous and inevitable. She placed a small advertisement in the Boston Herald. "M.W. Your daughter is home and understands everything."
E.C. carried your love until his final day. The lighthouse still watches over water that remembers every promise. S.C. Sarah never expected a response, but the act of reaching across the years to touch the ghost of her mother felt necessary, like completing a circle that had been broken for too long. 3 weeks later, she received an envelope postmarked from a small town in Oregon, with no return address, but handwriting that matched the careful script in Margaret's journal. Inside was a single sentence. "Thank you for letting me know that love finds its way home, even when the path seems impossible to follow." Sarah kept that note in the same cedar box where she preserved the embroidered handkerchief, the 2 silver lockets, and the journal that had finally revealed the truth about a love story that had been unfolding around her entire life. Sometimes, on particularly clear evenings, when the lighthouse beams swept across water that looked like liquid silver, she would take out these treasures and remember that some promises are kept not in the moment they're made, but across decades of patience, sacrifice, and faith that love is stronger than the circumstances that try to destroy it. The people of Millhaven gradually forgot the specific details of Edward Clarke's lost love, but they remembered him as a man who had carried himself with quiet dignity despite some ancient sadness that had shaped everything else in his life. They remembered Margaret Whitfield as a beautiful young woman who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, becoming one of those local legends that small towns preserve like pressed flowers between the pages of their collective memory. But Sarah knew the truth, that love stories don't always end with weddings and happily ever after. Sometimes they end with sacrifice that looks like abandonment, but is actually the deepest form of devotion. Sometimes they continue across generations, in children who find their way home to parents who never knew they existed. Sometimes they find completion not in the joining of 2 lives, but in the understanding that some forms of love are too large to be contained by a single lifetime, requiring decades of waiting, wondering, and finally accepting that the greatest love stories are often the ones that remain forever unfinished, forever reaching across impossible distances toward connection that transcends every obstacle the world can place in its path. Some kinds of love require sacrifice. Some kinds of love require silence. Some kinds of love require disappearing so that the person you love can remain safe. But the deepest kinds of love, the ones that matter most, find ways to continue even when continuation seems impossible, weaving themselves into new lives and new chances until the promise is finally kept, the circle is finally closed, and 2 hearts that were meant to beat together find each other again in ways that neither time nor circumstance can ever truly separate.